I'm very interested, I suppose my contribution will be, in a nutshell, is thinking about how brands and branding collide or interact with the social life of forests, if I can put it that way, if you want a kind of soundbite. And I don't pretend to have a definitive answer. You know, it's something that would take a lot of comparative studies and so on, and that's not what I'm doing here. But I'm just intrigued by on the one hand, the ubiquity in our era of the brand. And I was going to give lots of little anecdotes, but I'll boil it down to simply, when I was getting this PowerPoint talk done up, the technician sort of took charge, because I'm a real technological Neanderthal, I suppose. And so he took charge of it totally. And he, without telling me, zipped on our logo, the King's College London logo, which appears on every single one of these. And I think it reflects, not just in the UK, but this kind of corporatization of the university sector. And now they don't require that we do this, but it was strongly made clear to me that actually it was just accepted practice and you should have that on there. But I think it's just one little indicator, just one. I can think of many others, I'm sure you can, of how brands just kind of, you know, we swim in a world of brands today of various kinds. But of course, brands aren't new, and they're very kind of multi-layered and complex. And as I've begun to read on this kind of project and think about it, I've been thinking about the different kind of dimensions, as it were, or levels to brands and their use, and how these issues might relate to the branding of nature in general, and vis-a-vis the world of teak in particular, which is my kind of concern. And it's an opportunity for me to kind of revisit some work I was doing from a PhD and just afterwards in the 1990s, where I was looking at kind of the forest politics stuff that Nancy was talking about and has talked about before, vis-a-vis Burma. But interestingly enough, when I was going back through that work, 10 years later, realizing that actually I really wasn't centrally concerned with teak in there. Yes, it was teak forests, but you know what I mean? It was very much, the peasants fighting the forest officials and the bureaucratization and so on. And so teak, actually, when I went through the index and everything else, really didn't play much a role in that. And so what I'm kind of interested in the project, of which I draw upon it in this paper, is to think a bit more about teak, but particularly through the prism of brands and branding. Okay? So I'll try and do that fairly quickly, and I assume I push this button.
You have to sort it.
So many times started this.
I know,
Yeah,
it's like
right,
you have to find
It's the
hot zone.
there we are. Okay, fine. So yeah. So brands and branding. There's kind of a growing literature on brands. A lot of it, you won't be surprised, in kind of journals like the Journal of Brand Management and kind of the finance sector. And I'm sure you spend a lot of time, like I do, reading this sort of stuff. But interestingly enough, and again, I'm at an early stage here, so I'm sure I've missed a lot of stuff. I'm a bit surprised at how relatively little has been done outside of that kind of cloistered circle. There's stuff, of course, and everybody points to Naomi Klein's No Logo as the obvious one. But what's interesting is how often they point to that rather major work, and that's about it. There are other ones around. Celia Lurie, I think, at Sociology at Goldsmiths in London is doing some work on this. And of course, more and more is coming through. There's a literature looking at the wilder kind of margins of branding. For instance, the branding of the nation, and whether that's possible. Cool Britannia, I guess, would be one example. And this debate there about these sorts of issues. But whatever the merits of that, and I'm not here to defend brands or branding per se, I do think it's an interesting phenomenon that we're surrounded by every day of our lives, as it were, but perhaps we don't think as much as we should, or at least consider vis-a-vis nature and also particularly kind of forests. So that's kind of my concern. I know there is some literature around, but that's sort of where I'm coming from. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about brands and branding just very briefly, okay? I think it is late in the day. And then I want to move on to kind of mostly kind of Burma teak and think about Burma teak in particular, teak in general, Burma teak in particular, as a brand in itself, a sort of historical and contemporary brand. So it requires a bit of an initial discussion of what I mean by brand, of course, all right? And then I'll use examples vis-a-vis what I term 3 different tools of branding, or factors. Let's not get hung up on the words. Tools is rather precise, but a sense of things that come together in helping to create, directly or indirectly, a brand, if I can put it that way. And I've picked on the science, the violence, and marketing very broadly defined, because I'm really not into reading the Journal of Brand Management and the like, so my knowledge is not too precise there. So turning to kind of the issue of brands, first of all. I was interested in reading about it, thinking about the different kind of meanings, going back to the traditional sense of brands, which apparently comes from an old Norse word, brand, with an R on the end. and which has come into English meaning to burn or to mark. Yeah? And this traditional sense, if you think about it, has a very direct and clear affinity with nature. You know, the branding of nature is very much there. Think of livestock and so on. And there are various reasons why this has developed, going back centuries. Clearly, there's the issue of ownership, marking out ownership. There's also the issue of allowing some sort of informed discrimination in the marketplace. Okay, people can sort of get a sense of the quality of, you know, those cows or whatever, even if they don't know the owner directly. I'm going back in time here. And there's also the issue of brand developing and signifying in that mark on a cow or whatever a sense of quality. Yeah? Now that quality might be linked to issues of labor, quality of labor or skill in terms of raising cattle or whatever. It might also relate to kind of biophysical conditions, you know, the soils and so on. And all of this can come together in terms of a brand and vis-a-vis nature in terms of quality. So that's sort of the traditional sense, shall we call it, of brands. Over time, things developed, and when you get to kind of Industrial Revolution and that kind of era, you see brands becoming more kind of commercial, as it were, linked to organizations, the emergence of transnational corporations in the 19th century, 20th centuries, and, if you will, a more kind of commercial kind of calculus linked to other developments going on around that time in the 19th and 20th centuries. Advertising, organizational innovations of various kinds, communications technologies, a whole bunch of things kind of developing. And brands, in the modern sense that we often think about it, coming through this period. Again, cut a long story short, there's a certain sense in which one can talk about a lot of the brands that we're notably familiar with being kind of corporate-centered or corporate-led brands. And here I'm thinking of, you know, a lot of stuff that we're very well aware of, where corporations have built up an identity, and, you know, lifestyle choices and so on linked to a product, to the point where, you know, nowadays in a very kind of postmodern sort of way, that some see corporations killing off the product. Yeah? That the product is not so important. It's the lifestyle, it's the kind of philosophy, the spirituality, etc., of whatever's being peddled. So there's that kind of argument that the brand is dying. I think Naomi Klein said in her book, No Logo, something about how the metaphorical alligator on the Lacoste shirt has kind of consumed the T-shirt. You know, that certain sense of which, if you will, there's something much more going on than simply the product. On the other hand, I'd suggest there is a sense in which products themselves can actually be, if you will, a brand. They can become a sort of brand in and of themselves. And I kind of see Teak, Burma Teak in particular, Burma producing about 75% of kind of teak exports in the world for a long period in colonial times and post-colonial. I know it's shifted. It depends on the period. Obviously, there's ups and downs, and I won't go into that now. But it's obviously has been an important player, historically anyways. But one could argue that a lot of developments linked to science, linked to violence, as it were, linked to marketing, generated at a particular juncture in the 19th and 20th centuries as Burma Teak developing a particular brand. Not simply being a good wood, but actually elevating to something else, a particular kind of prestige product. And something reflecting, if you will, not simply quality, not just simply denoting quality, but actually connoting other things. You know, imperial luxury and lifestyle, a little bit of empire, I might term it. So that, in a sense, is kind of the background and context to branding. I can talk more about it if you want later on. The tools I talk about then are broadly defined, very broadly: science, violence, and marketing. It seems to me that science has played a very instrumental role, as many other roles and functions, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but it seems to me science has been a very important midwife to brand development, whether it be linked to Teak or other things as well. It's helped to create the conditions, yeah, the precursor, as it were, but also helped to manage brand development, particularly in the more modern sense today. There's a sense in which, for example, science provides some of the hard truths, in quotation marks. It provides kind of objective facts about certain things. For instance, the disease preventative qualities of, I don't know, toothpaste of certain kinds, you know, proven by science. The proven hygienic, clean quality of bottled water, okay, vis-a-vis public supplies, which historically have been either seen to be suspect, or perhaps in some cases were indeed suspect. So this aspect of kind of using science in these ways. The science of measuring, I don't know, quality of various kinds. Think of automobiles, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so science is there. It's imbricated in the essence of modern branding in a whole bunch of ways. There's also, though, it seems to me, the role of violence. And I don't want to say that creating brands necessarily assumes violence, but it does seem to occur a lot. I mean, even a cursory reading of Naomi Klein's book, you see a lot of sense of sweatshop labor and the like going on. You have, at the consumption end, the symbolic violence linked to representations of women, for instance. You have also things going on in the forest, where it links into kind of, for example, Teak, where you have the processes of violence, and I'll come to this, perpetrated against people in the forest and around the forests, but also violence to the forests themselves in various ways. So violence does play a role in brand development, both forest-based and elsewhere, nature-based and elsewhere, but in a very complex way, and it will vary depending on the case and the time and so on. Then, of course, there's marketing in the very kind of broad sense of the term, the ways in which brands are gotten up and thought of as being something much more than simply the product, the ways in which they are linked to essential lifestyle choices of various kinds, historically and in more and more in a contemporary way as well. Okay, so that's the kind of context, and then I want to kind of link it now to, if I get there, to the Burmese teak case. Well, again, a lot of this is familiar. I could be fairly brief running through this, and I've certainly looked at some of this, and others have, like Nancy before, in terms of talking about scientific forestry. My point here is to think about some of these things through the prism of brands and branding. So kind of a familiar story, but perhaps slightly seen from a different angle. So then we see the science of discovery, in quotation marks, of course, but this role, particularly in the colonial period with the British in Burma, involved in trying to figure out where these things are, these teak trees. You know, they're gaining a sense of their importance, going back to India, which you heard about earlier, and the way in which teak in southern India, for example, played a role, and the British became very interested in this. But it assumed a whole bunch of scientific practices to enable the location of these things, all right? If you will, the ability to find and then brand in the traditional sense of the term, to mark out these things. You have to find them in a sense first. So you have the whole process of mapping that takes place. You have as well a whole process of creating that bureaucratized workforce, you know, the scientific forestry departments, very organized in very precise ways linked to forestry science, in ways which to a greater or lesser extent lent themselves to elevating a valuable timber like teak into something like a brand. And I'll come to that. And then you also have extraction itself and a whole kind of science linked to extraction, particularly in the difficult circumstances of getting to remote teak forests in 19th century Burma. There's an example just of Burma and a map showing some of the teak areas, initial kind of basic mappings of some of the areas, with Puguyoma in the center region being one of the prime areas in the 19th century and beyond indeed. We have here a couple of slides showing a forestry department building in Burma. And again, on the different floors, you have different aspects of forestry. Again, to a greater or lesser extent, having a role in extraction, but more than that, in some cases, linking to the branding, traditional sense, but also the kind of more modern sense of branding as well. I think that's the other one. You can see ships and so on, two different shots there, from basically the forest through on to export. And here we have an example of the extraction, a particular technique called girdling or ring barking of teak trees. And there was a lot of debate about this when the British arrived, led by the German Dietrich Brandis in the 1850s. Very much interested in thinking of the merits of this. All right? There was a clear branding virtue. This is inherited from monarchical Burma, royal Burma, in that you literally marked out your trees, even as you killed them. The teak tree was a royal tree. The British took it on board, if you will, a state prerogative there. But something where you simultaneously branded it and actually seasoned it on the stalk. And a lot of debate then centered on the seasoning process. And I'll give you a quote of some of that sense of debate later on. Because the seasoning had a sense of the ways in which the quality of teak could be brought more visibly to the surface, as it were. Okay? There's also then the science of discovery, the science of growth. And again, I'm kind of classifying just for the sake of my argument. You know, the ideal natural state, where you have, okay, sooner or later, Well, two things here. Aside from kind of shamelessly peddling my book, which is still around somewhere, probably in secondhand bookshops now. It is 10 or 12 years old. Yeah, oh well, do it another time. It does show, there is a serious reason, it does show kind of a mature teak tree and kind of the sense in which a lot of what the foresters did was to go into the forest to measure, to map, to think about, how it relates to ideal soil conditions and so on. This wasn't any old, hardwood type tree. There's lots of other ones in that forest. It's teak, and teak was getting a lot of attention and money. And this very process itself, then, I'm suggesting, is elevating its status, too, okay, in terms of the investment of effort in this, at least, if you will, a mystique, which I'll come to in a second. Okay, but there's also then the plantations, a heavy investment in teak plantations. There's another whole history there. I don't want to go into it now, but the very sense of kind of doing monocultural teak plantations became very important as well. There's also, in a sense, a science linked to this issue of utility. And I think the British are particularly keen on utility of things, whether it be in the 21st century university sector or in thinking about things like teak, and its usefulness. It wasn't simply a case of saying, here's teak, it's in the forest, let's just cut it, find it, cut it, and so on, and mark it. It was also about a lot of scientific tests in laboratories, probing its strength, its durability, its elasticity, how it works, in the wood shop, and so on. And there was a whole sense of ways in which teak seemed to kind of epitomize, it was much more than the sum of any one property. Commercially linked properties, as I'm talking about. It combined a number of them. If I can just find a quote, this will illustrate it. Dietrich Brandis was writing,
His name's Brandis?
Dietrich Brandis, yes, I know, yes. I was going to leave that one, but that's fine. Coordinator's prerogative. Dietrich Brandis was probably the greatest forester of the 19th century. He influenced just about everybody you can think of, including Gifford Pinchot, founder of the U.S. Forest Service, who went to see him in Germany in, I think, early 20th century. Anyways, and he actually started his kind of adult career in his early 20s in Burma, because Burma was the prime area with the teak forests. And so he was actually not just the leading forester, but a leading expert on teak as well at the time, getting his hands dirty in the field for many years before moving to British India, India proper, and then back to London and ultimately Germany. Here he is speaking in 1888 about teak. And he's talking about kind of the benefits of girdling, ring barking as a seasoning thing, but it gives a broader sense, a glimpse into this science of utility, which they were very interested in. The principal value of teak timber is its extraordinary durability. Thus, once seasoned on the stalk, girdled, teak timber does not split, crack, shrink, or alter its shape. In these qualities, it is superior to most timbers. In contact with iron, neither the iron nor the teak suffers. And in this respect, it is far superior to oak, the traditional mainstay of the British. It is not very hard, it is easily worked, and takes a beautiful polish. It has great elasticity and strength, and it is not very heavy. And then he gives average weight and so on, and that it seasons very well. So in this kind of point, he's interweaving kind of an emerging kind of science of kind of utility with a clear kind of commercial calculation. Okay, in terms of making a case. It wasn't always clear in Burma as elsewhere that teak naturally was the most valuable timber. Yeah, it had to earn its place in a sense through trial and error, and I'll come to that in a second, but also against some skepticism among foresters. In fact, some of them, I won't go into it, I haven't got time, were actually decrying the teak mania, as they called it. And they'd say, try this other type of wood. It's just about as good as teak. But teak was always the yardstick. Just about as good as teak. As good as teak. Better than teak in some respects. And so that very sense of teak as a yardstick becomes very clear as we go through the kind of colonial period. There's a sense of the durability and the aesthetic then that's involved here. And we see this is much more recent. It's from the Guardian newspaper from 2004. And they always have these things about different consumer bits and baubles you might want to buy. And here you have a teak, wall-mounted wash basin, basically. And in a sense, it does get at some of the points I was saying. The sense of durability linked to water. I'll come back to that. Okay, but also the aesthetic. And then the price. You won't see it, but the price, let's see, right, is 685 pounds. So double that, and you get a sense. It's not for the average person, is it? So in a sense, there is a sense of distinction here going on. I'm going to come back to that in a second. How am I doing for time, all right?
You have 5 more minutes.
Okay, fine. I'm going to briefly go through this section because I think Nancy's covered a number of things, and I think we're generally familiar with it. So in a sense, I'll downplay the violence just a little bit to get on to the other section. But broadly, I've talked about here in the paper bandit forestry and then kind of counterinsurgency forestry. Bit of a crude distinction, I realize, but just for the arguments of the paper. And that sense of which violence was linked to this kind of branding and counter-branding of teak trees in the forest. I mean, literally, very much kind of insurgents using branding tools in that traditional sense to mark out or countermark. Think of counter-mapping. We have counter-branding going on, for instance, among the Karen hill groups on the Thai-Burmese border. So this whole process is going on. Again, it has historical antecedents in the colonial times, various sort of insurgent rebellions and the like happening, but also very low-level things where people simply came in and erased the marks of, I don't know, the Forest Department, and kind of shaded them over gently and put on their own marks, kind of surreptitious sort of things like that, all broadly linked to kind of bandit insurgent forestry. Then there's the counterinsurgency forestry. Again, I'll skip that because I think Nancy's highlighted the general point using other contexts. This is a shot of Myanmar, which was the capital of Kathule, the independent Karen state, just on the Thai border. This was taken in 1994. It was soon flattened by the Burmese military about 6 months after that. But they had a forest department there, all these sorts of things, and very much a, if you will, a science of utility, but also obviously funding their insurgency. But there's also the kind of structural violence in the kind of Galtungian, Johan Galtung's kind of traditional way of thinking of structural violence, which kind of gets beyond the immediate kind of shooting in the forest kind of stuff, which, again, if you think about it as whether structural violence or, in a Foucauldian sense, kind of government, surveillance, censorship, monitoring, and so on, there are many examples. And again, I won't go into them here, but two that I pick out in the paper. One, fire prevention. Getting fire out of teak plantations, probably the wrong decision ecologically, but leaving that aside, a lot of money and effort was put into that, and it involved a lot of kind of violence against local livelihoods and so on, because people were, if you will, dragooned into being fire prevention officers in villages across Burma. So a lot of expense and disruption occurred, disrupting people's lifestyles. And then there's the Tanya forestry, which involves the traditional problem of the shifting cultivator, and trying to sort of stop them doing these kind of burnings of forests, including teak trees, and trying to get them to be allies. Again, it's a familiar story. But we have this context where, again, the Karen shifting cultivators in Burma were well aware that they were being planted out of existence. A way of life was being eliminated. As they planted up, the forest became converted to permanent stocks of forest. So there's a certain structural violence there as well. Turning to the issue of marketing, then, very briefly. Initially, the teak timber in Burma, as elsewhere, was notably linked to the military, to the Navy in particular. And there's a certain sense in which the Navy effectively saw this as particularly desirable for the reasons I just had in the quote. It really bore up well in water, salt water. You could put spikes into it and it wouldn't rust, a whole bunch of reasons, right? And so in a sense, in this early period, I wouldn't necessarily call it marketing, but the Navy, effectively, the British Navy, the world's greatest imperial force at the time, effectively became kind of the standard bearer, as it were, of teak. Yeah? Demonstrating through the hard strategic choices that these sorts of strategic planners make that this was a wood above and beyond oak and other types. Of course, substitutes were developed, other things came in later on, but teak was still there right into the 20th century. Maybe not in terms of the sidings of the boats, but it was there in terms of the decks, for example, the door frames, and so on and so forth. Some teak logs in Burma and Rangoon. I'll move on. Again, a whole process in which teak is also then caught up in a sense of boy's own adventure almost. Both in the forest, the teak elephant, lots of stories written about this, both for boys but also for adults, grown-up boys as it were. The sense of kind of daring and adventure against the elements in the forest, but also on the seas. All of this is kind of combining to generate, intentionally or otherwise, a mystique around teak, making it something particularly distinctive, unique as it were, as a species, not any old wood. And indeed, one can add that as you move in through the 19th century into the 20th century, you see effectively teak literally cladding the empire, not just the ships, but you see it in terms of the public buildings. You see it in terms of initially the railway ties, the linking, binding the empire together. Of course, it got expensive. They went with substitutes later on, but you had then teak used for, as George Orwell points out, the European clubhouse. You know, the clubhouse, you know, the walls in Burmese days, he talks about the clubhouse, you know, reeking of teak oil and teak wood. Yeah, and this kind of very sense of the importance of teak that way. You know, it literally clad, as it were, the empire. And indeed, just to add to that, the sense in which teak's symbolic qualities here should not be overlooked in an imperial sense. Yeah? Teak, after all, was prized for its durability. And the British Empire was meant to endure. So we have a certain sense in which it's not perhaps, maybe it's unintended. They were just thinking of, hey, teak fights off the white ants, so it actually preserves well in the tropics. But there is that sort of symbolic sense of teak actually lasting. You know, we have examples of the cutty sark, which until just recently, when it burned in London, still being, you know, kind of going strong. Unfortunately, it was burned in an accidental fire. With a sense, again, of kind of pointing to that example of teak, how it endures over centuries. Well, think in the imperial sense of discourse, and you can see my point. And again, there's more of that in the paper. But then it kind of moves out in the 20th century, I'd suggest, and it kind of becomes caught up in this process of middle-class self-fashioning, as one scholar has put it, a scholar of kind of colonial consumption. And you see this kind of process. And I'd suggest that there's various aspects to this. And again, I'm just really beginning on this area, so it's kind of still a bit new to me in terms of the consumption. But the demonstration effect. When you look at kind of the colonial period into the early 20th century, you see teak being associated with, obviously, the railways, but also modern liners. Just before World War II, the two biggest liners in the world, the Queen Mary and was it the Queen Elizabeth, both had more than 1,000 tons of teak on them. Teak decks, teak wind frames, and so on. You know, people who were traveling, colonial officials, their families, and so on, were surrounded by teak. So on the one hand, you have a sense of modernity in the transport revolutions going on. You also have teak being literally embodied in this process at this time. So there's that demonstration effect, which I would suggest, I have to do more on this, you see kind of moving through to people's individualized consumption choices. You see it in the colonies, people making their bungalows, colonial bungalows, Singapore, elsewhere, perhaps of teak, all right? And then it kind of moves out beyond that. Now this process has kind of had its ups and downs in the 20th century. And again, I won't go into the details, there's no time, because of problems in Burma and so on. But teak, as if you will, had a sort of a second coming in recent years. It's got a lot to do with kind of the fireside clearance sale going on in Burma, where they're clearing teak and other forests as quickly as they can, for reasons I'm sure you're well aware of. And it's turning up in various consumption sites around the world, including here. And so here, this one's from Singapore, a shop called Teak and Mahogany. And again, in the tropical context in Southeast Asia in particular, you see teak being quite highly prized. Here the logo is, enjoy resort living in your own home with our export quality teak. You know, the sense of middle class distinction coming to the fore. Yeah? There are many examples, I had to be selective. But, you know, the teak lounger, a modern update with, was it a wire brush stainless steel in a wonderful marriage of modernity and tradition. But again, it's teak. There are other things as well, but it seems to me that teak is sort of maintaining that role, as long as supplies last, of course. And so effectively, it's still, if you will, playing a role. There is a sense of boycott happening of sorts, efforts in the US, in parts of Europe, to try and boycott, given what's been happening in Burma. But there is a real kind of beauty in the boycott, I think I put it on the overhead slide, where obviously there's the whole route through China and everything else, but there is that kind of perverse fascination, I guess, with teak still. You know, it's sort of enduring qualities, its durability, particularly in terms of things that come into contact with water, its sense of distinction. And perhaps, if you will, the kind of a variation on the commodity fetish, a willingness or preparedness not to sort of know about these things. You know, it's just a nice wood. I don't want to know where it's come from and why. So these sort of processes continue to this day, and particularly I haven't had a chance to talk about it, but in the whole yachting industry, not something that the average poor person is involved in. You know, teak decks. You know, you can go on cruises on old teak yachts. You know, they'll have recycled. That's the kind of you know, kind of nice gloss to it. The sort of recycled teak that is used in some of these contexts. Not a lot of debate, though, in terms of thinking about where that teak's coming from. But I would suspect a lot of people in the yachting sector aren't too concerned about that. They want something that's durable and classy, and perhaps gives a little sense of the empire. Again, through colonial times, teak wasn't simply for those who had lots of money. The average person as well, in Britain as elsewhere, could obtain a little piece of empire, and I mean little. It might be a little sort of teak elephant. It might be a little teak ashtray. these sorts of things. And indeed, these were selling like hotcakes, apparently, at the 1938 Glasgow exhibit, if my memory serves me well. So these sorts of processes are continuing to this day. And I'll just conclude then, because I think I'm going to be running out of time. Teak is no ordinary wood, but it's not sort of naturally apparent why it's such a superior wood. And again, one can debate the various qualities that are involved there. The point I'm getting at, through using these various tools of kind of science, violence, which helps to manage, shall we call it, the production context, re-engineer whatever words you want, and if you will, in the broadest sense of the term, marketing of this particular timber, has had a life that's kind of come and gone over the years, but certainly is going strong today. And so very much an important example of a type of wood that stands out and has, if you will, developed a life of its own, a brand identity as a product. It evokes a whole range of things. It has connotations as well as a simple denotation of quality, for instance. But that's linked as well to this whole idea of kind of seduction. Think of the yachts, the lovely garden furniture, and of course the fear that we're well aware of in terms of the branded teak forest. Okay, the whole kind of dynamic there. Looking more generally beyond Burma and teak, because you might well say, well, that's very kind of precise in this one example, and I agree, totally. Okay, it seems to me that a lot more research could be done on looking at, if you will, more generally the role of branding in those multiple senses, traditional, corporate-centered, if you will, product-centered, the various ones, and the role of the social life of the forests. I'm not quite sure in kind of looking at this with the Burma case, whether from the point of view of activists, whether activists should be looking at this and saying, no, it has to be anti-branding. And we have a sense from Naomi Klein and so on that it's who's focusing on the commercial sense, that kind of very rarefied one that we see today, the Nike thing and all that, that it's somehow inherently bad. But I haven't sort of had a chance to think it through enough in terms of whether it could, for example, be turned to advantage in terms of various campaigns. Could it be a tool in various ways to actually kind of push forward various efforts by, I don't know, smallholders linked to forest resurgence, where they might be able, depending on the wood, a bit of luck as well, to actually, if you will, brand it in certain ways. A long day.
Sort of the New World counterpart to that, of course, is mahogany,
Yes.
which has its so many similarities to
Yes.
it. Okay, questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Ray, I don't know if you know the term positional good. It seems to me that branding is an attempt, in some senses, to create take a particular commodity and turn it into a positional good. I guess the question is, what kind of impact do you think that has, if it's successful, on the consumption of it, and therefore on its environmental impact?
Yeah, one would perhaps expect that if there's great success, that you would see a rise in consumption. It depends on a lot of things, income availability and so on. But perhaps in the current context, with sort of perhaps the economic circumstances here are stagnant, but a lot of kind of growth going on in China and India, for example, that in middle class, if you will, expectations changing, which may well be quite different, I don't know, but it seems to me that sometimes there are elements of sort of looking for similar markers of distinction, particularly in the context of woods like this coming out of Asia, that you would see reinforcing overconsumption, and indeed one does see a lot of overconsumption going on. I mean, while the military generals in Burma are flogging this stuff in other hardwoods via China as much as they can, it does still assume a certain demand around the world.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that this was Burma teak. And so my question is, how did you know the difference between Burma teak and Java teak, particularly in the more contemporary era, because you have a couple of things happening from the 1980s, right? So first you have, in the 1980s, the Forest Stewardship Council and Smartwood people certifying Java teak as sustainable. Then you have them taking that away, the sustainability certification. And then you have the fall of Suharto, when one of the first things that happens is all these people living in the teak forests in Java run into the teak forest and cut them down. So it's the same moment that you would have this huge glut on the market in teak, and the kind of things circulating among Java activists or Indonesian forest watchers was that a lot of this teak furniture stuff that you were referring to was coming out of these forests in the aftermath of the kind of Suharto fall. So I wonder if you could comment on that branding bit.
Yes, no, totally valid comment. And that was my slight hesitation about when I'm referring to Burma teak, because I think that a change happens in the post-colonial era where the distinction, it kind of falls back to teak. I think kind of pre-World War II, right before World War II, where something like 75% of the exports were from Burma, with the rest from Java and Siam and so on and so forth. In a sense, that sense of teak as exported around the world, not necessarily used domestically, actually was Burma teak. So there was, in a sense, an equation, rightly or wrongly, but to a large extent. And people would refer to that Burma teak. There still is the odd reference to that, although I have seen references to Java teak as well, and usually referring back to the earlier period with certification. So in that sense, yeah, in a sense, it's a bit of a difficult one to highlight today, but particularly given the wish, if you will, given the violence going on above all in Burma, to, if you will, not necessarily play that up. Whereas in the past, they would have wanted to play that up in colonial times, the Burma link and so on. Now it's a case of really not being too concerned about it, but it's the teak that stands out. Yeah. So in that sense, no. Whether that basin that I was showing, was Javanese teak or Burmese or whatever, increasingly that begins to break down, I think, in the modern era. Certainly in this latest rush since the early 1990s. So your point's taken totally.